Good morning, everybody. It's so wonderful to be here at Occidental College on this beautiful sunny day, a very typical Los Angeles day. My name is Angelica Salas, and I am, class of '93. And it is so wonderful to welcome you to the 2022 Alumni Seal Conversation with my dear friend, a person I respect so much, Clarissa Martínez De Castro, class of '89. Clarissa is this year's recipient of the Alumni Seal Award for service to the community, and we are honored to have her during the Alumni Reunion Weekend to discuss what's often misunderstood about Hispanic voters and why getting it right can benefit our democracy. Since 1965, the Alumni Association has paid tribute to inspiring alumni who represent the values and the spirit at the core of the Oxy experience. Seal Awards are given annually in the categories of service to the community, professional achievement, service to the college, the Young Alumni Achievement, and the Emirati Faculty and Alumna of the Year Award. Clarissa Martínez De Castro, class of '89, is passionate about strengthening civil society. As Deputy Vice President for Policy and Advocacy at Unidos US, the largest national Latino civil rights and advocacy organization, she oversees the efforts to advance fair and effective immigration policies and to expand Latino civic engagement by helping immigrants become citizens, citizens become voters, and the community overall to become active participants in the policy debates. She has advocated at the federal and state levels on issues impacting Latinos, has experience overseeing and developing polling projects on Latino voters and issues impacting the community, and has also designed Rise Above, a pilot initiative to build a positive, accurate narrative of our changing America that fosters collaborative action. She has produced reports and articles on the Latino electorate and testified countless of times at congressional hearings on immigration. She's a frequent commentator on the Latino electorate and immigration issues on television, radio, and print media. She's a graduate of the class of '89 and Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. She's a U.S. Vote Foundation board member, a 2015 Presidential Leadership Scholar, a member of the Ad Council's Advisory Committee. She previously serves as manager of the Coalition for Comprehensive Immigration Reform, the public policy coordinator for the Southwest Voter Research Project. She was also an assistant director of the California-Mexico Project and of the University of Southern California. She began her work as an organizer for the Ladies Garment Workers Union and was a representative of the Hotel Employee and Restaurant Employees Union, Local 11. She was formerly undocumented. She came to the U.S. as a teenager, and she is now a naturalized citizen. Please join me in welcoming one of the people I most love and respect, who I have the honor to see her contribution day in and day out. Please join me in welcoming Clarissa Martínez De Castro.
Thank you. Well, coming from one of our greatest heroes, that means a lot. And I say our because my husband actually works in the immigration movement as well. So we've had a chance to work hand in hand with Angelica for many years. So thank you all. Were it not for COVID, I would say move closer, but stay where you are. And wow, that goes on a lot. That was very long. So hopefully the presentation won't be as long and we can actually chat. But let me go through a couple of quick things, and then I would just love to get into a conversation. One of the reasons I wanted to talk about Hispanic voters is because every time we go into an election cycle, we hear the same stories, what I call erroneous conventional wisdom, right? You hear contradictory points and some that have an element of truth, but a whole thing gets spun around them. And sometimes the facts are easier and also more complicated, right? What I mean by that is every time the election rolls around, you hear the Latino vote is the sleeping giant, they're apathetic, they're not going to vote, or Latinos are all immigrants, and therefore if you see Latinos voting, that is proof that there's election fraud. You hear that they're all Democrat. As of the last couple of elections, you hear that they're all running to the Republican Party. You hear they only care about immigration, or they don't care about immigration, right? All kinds of things like that. So I normally just like to start with a little level setting on some of the facts. And so we'll call it five good things to know about the Latino vote, right? So one is that Latinos are actually one of the fastest growing segments of the American electorate. In 2020, we actually became the second largest voting age population. Voting age population is a key piece, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But going to the point that many folks see Latinos as all immigrants, and I am an immigrant, and therefore not citizens, the reality is that 8 out of 10 Latinos in America today, in the United States, are United States citizens. And if you look at Latinos under 18, more than 90% of them are United States citizens. So one of the reasons we're one of the largest growing segments of the electorate is because we are a very young population. And every year, about an average million young Latino citizens turn 18 and become eligible to vote. So between the last presidential and this midterm election, we have about 2 million young Latinos who are eligible to register to vote. The other interesting thing about this electorate, and that also reflects the American electorate overall, is that Latinas represent the majority of the Hispanic electorate. They're about 54% of voting of the voting Hispanic community, and more than half of them are under 44 years old. More than half of the Latinas who cast a ballot in the last election are under 44. So there's one fact. The second one is that registered Latinos vote, right? So you've heard the thing about we don't vote, we're apathetic. The first thing I always tell people is erase apathetic from the conversation. A community that has the largest labor force participation in the country, who is about family, who is about service to the nation, as shown by our participation in the armed forces, is not apathetic. We are unconvinced. We are unconvinced for a variety of very legitimate reasons that political participation can produce transformational change. And I think that's another thing that we're seeing right now in the American electorate. And while there are legitimate reasons to feel frustrated about what's happening, that is why we also have to work. This is the moment we have to work the hardest to make sure that people don't disengage, because we need a strong civil society in order to get things back on the right course. So lots of folks think Latinos don't vote. In presidential elections, Latinos who are registered, 80 to 83% of them vote, which is very close with the overall percentage of registered Americans that vote. The critical piece is that there are almost as many Latinos who are eligible but not yet registered as there are those of us who are registered and vote. So if we were to close the registration gap de la noche a la mañana, from one moment to the next, you would double the voting number, the Latinos who actually are casting ballots. So that's why voter registration remains a very critical piece of the electoral puzzle for Latinos. And sadly, as you know, of the incredible and somewhat obscene amounts of money that gets spent every election cycle, very little of that goes to voter registration. And it's a critical need, certainly for Latinos, because we're a young population, but there are many unregistered Americans. and very little of those funds go towards that. Obviously, during midterm elections, we know that all groups drop off or experience drop off. So that's one of the reasons why GOTV or get out the vote efforts are also incredibly important. And fun fact, even though Latinos experienced some serious drop off in midterm elections, in the 2018 midterm, Latinos turned out at near presidential levels. And in fact, many of the districts where Latinos are the majority were districts that experienced the largest levels of participation in 2018. But one critical thing is that that was a result in large part to the community organizing itself. And you actually have people like Angelica, who's been at it here in California for a long time, and we're seeing a lot of that in a lot of different states. So again, this demonstrates the importance of voter registration or of get out the vote efforts. Number 3, it's the no-brainer. And some of these really are no-brainers, right? Candidates matter, their positions matter, and meaningful outreach, again, we go to outreach, is essential. And yet, even though you have an electorate that is one of the fastest growing, more than 60% of highly likely to vote Latino registered voters say they don't hear from parties or candidates in an election cycle. And that included the last 2 election cycles, which were highly competitive. People are still not getting enough outreach. And perhaps because of that, and also perhaps because of the state of things, in the last previous elections, many Latino voters, in some cases even a plurality of those who cast ballots, said that their reason or motivation for voting was more to support giving a voice to the community than voting for the Republican or Democratic candidate that was in the ticket. The other point is that, again, this is not a no-brainer, but it gets discussed in very interesting ways. Our community, the Latino community, is not a monolith, but we are strongly aligned on critical issues. And again, that I also think, if you look at polling and other things like that, is a reflection of the larger American electorate. By landslide majorities, Latinos believe, for example, that we should expand background checks for gun sales and transfers, that we should support increasing the minimum wage, and that we should expand affordable housing. We, as a community, oppose an outright ban on abortion, and we are concerned about the rise of discrimination and want to see a humane immigration reform and a better system achieved, among many other things. And interestingly enough, if you look at polling, the majority of American voters actually are aligned on a lot of the solutions to these issues that seem intractable once you translate that in the context of Congress these days. So the last piece, which I also find interesting, and it reminds me, this phrase that every microcosm is a reflection of the larger universe around it, is that in our multiracial democracy, Latinos embody multiracial, right? You cannot have a Latino community without having all of the race groups that we have, different ethnicities, different backgrounds, being native born, naturalized, or aspiring American immigrant to the United States. So we come in all colors and faiths and political affiliations. Some of us are recent immigrants, and many others trace their roots in this land to beyond the birth of the nation. We are Black, white, Asian, indigenous, and everything in between. And interestingly, like in our country today, at times we embrace those identities, and at times we struggle with them. So I think that as Latinos strengthen their footing in all of these spaces, we can be a very powerful ally in navigating in strengthening civil society and its role in demanding accountability for a government that is respectful of all of its people and that includes the experiences of all of its people. So I am very honored to be able to work towards those ends in a work that is always a work in progress. So how do all these things come together? I think that since we're talking about why getting some of these things right would be useful to all of us in terms of the strengthening of our democracy, is that I think the full engagement of Latino voters would mean growing the ranks of those who want to see solutions to some of our pressing challenges and demanding accountability from those who claim to represent us. I think it would grow the ranks of those who espouse a more balanced approach between not only honoring the whole, the old phrase of pulling yourself by your bootstraps and believing in hard work, but also understanding and supporting the fact that government has a very important role to play in leveling the opportunity playing field for everyone. And also, last but not least, in a long list, is that the full activation of Latinos as civic participants, as voters. We can also be partners in strengthening that civil society I speak about, our institutions, and our system of democracy. I feel that we have seen a lot of growing attacks against immigrants, against Latinos, and in some ways, it's because we embody certain things that are creating anxiety in our country, and we become a face for them. But we can also be part of the opportunity of overcoming some of the ugly chapters that we're going through. Anyway, so that's kind of where I want to leave it, because I am more interested in hearing from folks about what may be some of the things you have heard that you believe are misconceptions, or some of the things you have questions about, or some of the things that you have experienced yourself. And of course, I'm not the only expert here. As I mentioned, Angelica has been hard at it for a long time. We at Unidos, I should have mentioned, at Unidos US, formerly National Council of La Raza, we have worked over the last decade. We've registered over 800,000 voters and have learned a great deal by doing that in different states with, again, a community that is diverse, but importantly, among whom there's a great deal of alignment on some of the things we're all interested in seeing solved. So let me stop there, and I'm going to kick it to Angelica to open it up first. But if you want to raise your hand, or I think they're, and you have a mic. There you go. And while Angelica comes to the mic, by the way, I just want to take a point of privilege that one of the people that helped me survive Oxy in making sure that while I was experimenting with breaking a lot of eggs, I didn't break my head, is Laura Acosta, who was the house resident advisor at one of the student houses I lived in. So thank you. Class of 87.
Did you hear? I think the questions are about residency. So I think we should actually begin with everybody, and maybe at the end we have some questions here relevant to California. So.
Sure.
Okay, so going back to '88, California had a great get out the vote, well funded by then our state senator, and it was very effective. You mentioned 800,000 with Unidos effort. I'm wondering how has the reaching out to the community, what are the main sources of information? Is it face-to-face, house visits, brochures, ads, and so forth? Because I know it can be done. I was part of that movement. I will forever be proud of that. And I'm really happy to know that that continues. I think your presentation was really on target in how diversified we are, being 45 years in LA and now being part of New Mexico. And I can see, no, we're not all monolithic for sure. I'm wondering what the major effort is now to make sure that everyone gets registered to vote, whether it's putting out those, folding ironing boards, whether it's house to house, whether it's house visits. What is the major effort going out through Unidos and similar organizations and local organizations. What's happening now?
So interestingly, because the world has changed dramatically thanks to technology, but the most effective method of engaging people continues to be face-to-face, right? So for those of you who've been involved in voter registration efforts in the past, and you think about paper and clipboard, that personal connection continues to be the most effective. It is also incredibly labor intensive and very expensive, right? So we continue doing that kind of work. As a matter of fact, we run one of the strongest Latino voter registration operations in Florida, and our canvassers are out in the community already. But we are also exploring at the same time ways to look at creating ecosystems that are conducive to participation and that can leverage existing infrastructures. The reason is that there's more than 12 million Latinos just in the Latino community alone, not to mention all other American voting eligible populations. There are 12 million at least eligible to register. There's just not enough funding at current levels of funding that even if you could do that kind of labor-intensive person-to-person operation everywhere, could really close that gap. So in addition to those of us who continue doing field operations, and there's a large number of organizations doing that, we also have more folks leveraging online and digital tools, which more young Latinos, young hip Latinos, I should say, because there's a lot of young Latinos and not all of them are what we may picture. But there's a lot more folks that are comfortable transacting online, so making those tools available as well. And so you are talking about digital, canvassing, and then exploring different ways to leverage government offices that are supposed to be offering voter registration, but some do less than others. Interestingly enough, the DMV continues to be one of the most used places for people to register. And because of the way that funding is structured in the civic engagement space, there is a disincentive to actually leverage that. And so that's what I mean by trying to look at ecosystems, is we are trying to look at how to depart from a point of view of community assets rather than deficits, map the assets in a community, create the connective tissue between local registrars, schools, DMV, and other places so that we can take advantage of existing infrastructure at the same time that we continue some of the hand-to-up in person and we can have a more expansive show. And to your point, Laura, one of the things we I remember hearing this every time I go out into neighborhoods is you invariably come across people that say, nobody has talked to me about this before, ever, right? And so those conversations really matter. And that's why I always say meaningful outreach is essential, whether you're a party, whether you're a candidate, or whether you're organizing in the community. The other thing, by the way, that you alluded to and I didn't mention, because that is a whole ball of wax, it's just also reflective of what we're seeing in the country. Latinos were a ginormous target of mis and disinformation in the last cycle, and we are seeing that both in Spanish language, in English language, but also in Spanish language, where there's a little bit less oversight even than what's happening in English language. Lots of mis and disinformation, and we're only seeing that grow. All right, right here. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Barbara DeBoule. I'm class of 64, so I'm one of the older people here. Y hablo español because I was in Peace Corps training in Puerto Rico in 1963. And so I've had a lot of additional interaction with Latino populations, one of which you mentioned because I'm a speech pathologist. I worked at several different veterans facilities, and very often the veteran knew English because he went into the service, but his families did not, and so So I'm really glad you brought out that population. Excellent presentation. I had to take notes, and you had so much information that I'm not sure I got all of it down. But I agree 100%. Not just with Latinos. The average voter does not get information. They don't know what they're voting about. I'll give an example. In 1978, my job was for the American Speech and Hearing Association, review legislation and decide what our policy should be towards it. Well, the U.S. this was, as I said, 1978. The U.S. had just voted for a health, now I'm not even going to remember the name of it, but a new healthcare organization. There were supposed to be HSA agencies in each state. All right, well, it took quite a while to build buildings, to get staff, to make policies and everything. What did they do in the next election? They voted it out. They voted another health, It's very expensive and it's very frustrating because you go with what the voters want, but in 4 years they vote something else and any informed person would say, oh yeah, no, we don't want to do that. But we're not informed. We're not informed. And so I think, and the third thing I think that I want to point out is, well, I'm very happy that you're emphasizing the younger voter, because I live in Sun City and we're full of older voters. And they're not in touch with, of course they want to see a future for their grandkids and they want to see the world go forward, but they're still voting like they did in 1950, So I really think that we need to concentrate on, and the final thing, if candidates would only get platforms and if parties would only get platforms, something we can look at and to agree with or disagree with, but so much in the last couple of elections, it was all about, they didn't have real platforms that we could, vote for or against. Okay.
It is a challenging thing. I am part of a policy department, so we deeply care about policy. But the reality is that voters have a lot of different barometers they use to gauge candidates. Sometimes it's candidates that can at least feel like they're comfortable in the room with you, right? With a group, with a community. Former President Bush had that in spades with the Latino community. He just walked into the room and you could feel he was comfortable. And that meant a lot for people, right? But it is a tricky balance. We often hear a lot from folks who are considering going into, maybe registering to vote. I just don't feel that I know enough to vote and I don't want to vote then. Well, we need to work to make sure people have more information, but at the same time, working in Washington, D.C., I am acutely and sadly aware that there are tons of members of Congress who don't know what they're voting about either, and they do it every day. So working to ensure that more of us are at least minding the store and keeping an eye on what they're doing is really important. And so we invite people to nevertheless start participating, and the more they participate, as you all who are habitual voters know, the more you participate, the more information you get. It should be the other way around, but that's just how it works. So anyway, go ahead. And then here.
I was just wondering, during this last election, there are a lot of sound bites on a lot of commercials, a lot of social media. Do you think some of the younger people are making their decisions according to the commercials they hear and getting all these negative sound bites about candidates or in social media sound bites instead of really investigating and knowing what candidate, they really need to vote for?
I think we all are being influenced by what we're seeing in social media. And even though we all complain about the negativity and the toxicity in elections, political operators continue to use that because they work. they may not work to increase your feel good and support for a particular candidate, but they do work to undermine your potential support for the candidate that's being attacked. So the short answer is we are all susceptible to it. The other one is understanding that, I mean, you all here are super voters. That ain't the majority of the American public. And there's a lot of very good reasons why. People are busy focusing on things that they think are going to have a more direct and immediate impact in what they do. And there's a lot of frustration about whether politicians really do that. So we often talk to people. The other thing is that if you hear politicians and parties, what do they say every time they're campaigning? This is the most important election of your lifetime. Sometimes it has a ring of truth, right? But think about for that person and their family, things may be a little different. Maybe their community won't be as under attack. But in terms of a transformational change in their daily life, that is not going to be like from one day to the next with an election. And so people start becoming very skeptical about those things. So in our conversations, we often talk to people about, hey, this is like going to high school. You didn't get your degree the day you walked in. You had to keep at it for some time. And that is part of the process, is part of the journey, right? So we just try to be more honest with folks so that when we're not selling fool's gold, that when it doesn't materialize, people actually lose faith in participating. Right here? Wait, this gentleman here, sorry, and then we'll go over there, I promise.
Yeah, I'm Don Smith, class of 72, Presbyterian minister, longtime collaborator with Angelica, and very happy. I'm so grateful you're presenting today. This hits me where I live, exactly. And as a gringo, I have a similar concern. It's the migrant caravans. What do we do? If I had hair, I would be tearing it out. But how to combat the fear that gets generated by the media? They use that. They use that shamelessly. And I don't know what to do about it.
We have a club. We have a club that it's pulling our hair out and trying to figure it out. But I'm glad you brought up immigration. I mentioned, right, that one of the misconceptions is the only thing Latino voters care about is immigration, or they don't care about immigration. And so it's an interesting thing. If you look over the last several decades at the top of mind issues for Latino voters, they have tended to be jobs in the economy and education. And it makes sense, right? You need a good job to be able to support your family, and you need quality education to make sure that you and your kids do better, right? The upward mobility that has been part of the ethos of the American dream. Immigration has tended to rise up on the scale of concerns, particularly when it turns toxic, which has been very toxic. Because what happens is that regardless of your immigration status, whether you are one of those who has been here since before the country's birth, or you are Generation Zero like me, whenever the immigration debate goes toxic, it impacts the civil rights and civil liberties of all Latinos, regardless of immigration status. So when it's part of the political conversation, it can pack a powerful motivational punch in terms of engagement. One of the things that is really complicated about immigration, in addition to, the policy, frankly, we've been at the policy solution for so long that we have binders full of immigration legislative proposals. That is not the issue here. I think that immigration has become a proxy for folks who seek to generate, fabricate, and fuel division among us the American community. And immigration is used as a proxy to fuel that antagonism, particularly against the Hispanic community, because the issue is mostly associated with Hispanics, even though the immigrant community is incredibly diverse. The same way that crime is used as a proxy to stir up fear and anxiety about African Americans and Latinos, and the same way that religion is used as a proxy to stir up anxiety about Muslims and other religions. They are tactics that are being used to fuel the kind of division that undermines civil society. Why? Sure thing. Some of the folks that are doing this are anti-immigrant and they're nativists, and their ultimate goal is to see anti-immigrant policies reign the day. Others are more opportunistic. They know that if we are busy being afraid and defending or protecting ourselves from each other or attacking each other's, we are going to be distracted from actually holding them accountable for what they're supposed to be doing, which is dealing with some of the problems at hand, which gets what? The majority of Americans actually agree on what needs to be done. So that is one of the reasons what that makes the immigration issue more complicated, is that in addition to trying to solve the complexity of those policies, we are also dealing with it being used as a proxy for issues that have nothing to do with immigration. And of course, in the immigration arena, it is a system where many of its parts are designed to work in tandem, and yet the only part that we have been investing boatloads of millions of dollars in has been the enforcement part. You can continue doing enforcement until the cows come home, but if you don't fix the other parts of the system, it's not going to work. And in the meantime, we know that, what is attractive to people in media, what is a good story, is when you have rivals in arguments. And that's what you see on TV. But as my husband will tell you, he works for America's Voice, polling over the last decade or more, even during the height of the Trump administration, who was not an immigrant-friendly administration, the majority of the public continued to support the legalization of those long-rooted in the country, fair treatment of immigrants, and we just need to continue figuring out how to get that voice be the loudest voice in the room. And we had several folks there. Sorry, I promised to be shorter.
I get motivated when I see how out of touch our Congress people are. Let me give you 2 examples. Right now, there's a movement to restrict voting, and in Arizona, they're passing legislation to restrict voting to Election Day, despite the fact that 80% of ballots were cast before Election Day. And just hearing that makes my mind pop, and that motivates me to find out, okay, who is trying to limit this? And then your last comment was, there was something else. Oh, well, gun control. Apparently, at least 3/4 of the population, I believe, favors reasonable gun control, despite what the NRA says. And so there's such a disparity. If so many people favor something reasonable, it's frightening that the NRA has power to say, nope, nothing. Anyway, and so
I think that one thing I would say, we have offices in several states, and Arizona is one of the states we work in. So we are seeing the voting suppression bill spread like wildfire across the country. And I guess the one thing I would say is not that they are, in that case, restricting vote by mail, which, by the way, Arizona is like way ahead and has been doing that for years. It's not despite the fact that many people vote by mail. The reason they are doing it is because many Arizonas vote by mail. And that is the nefarious thing about what's going on. And I think that that the very reason why these measures are in place are actually being turned around and used to actually take away that access. That is the fascinating Machiavellian thing that you're seeing, is that the arguments to pass laws that make it harder for eligible Americans to vote are being advanced under the guise of protecting election integrity. It is a fact. We were talking about narrative yesterday. It is just fascinating to see how those things are being turned on their head.
I'm Eloise Porter, class of 67, local to LA. And I'm really sorry that I missed your talk because we came in as you were doing questions. You mentioned disinformation, and we know pretty much where disinformation is disseminated for English speakers. Can you comment on the modes it's disseminated for Spanish speakers?
It's very much of the same, right? You are using, as a matter of fact, there's been a large purchasing of radio stations, Spanish language radio stations, where now the content is controlled, right? And you see a lot of the things you can imagine, right? About communism, about a number of things like that. So it's not just through radio, but it's actually purchasing radio stations. There's actually 2 colleagues of ours who just announced they achieved funding to buy a number of radio stations to kind of counter that wave. But it's through radio. It's through social media. Many Latinos are turning to YouTube and other places like that to get information. A lot of us use WhatsApp to communicate, and I can attest during the pandemic, the level of misinformation that was being passed around because folks found it and they shared it with our family and our cousins and all of that. Somebody who sounded credible, seemed to have credentials and things like that. But that was 2 significant trends we saw in addition to, or in spite of the diversity in the Latino community, some constant threads that we saw in the last election were lackluster outreach by campaigns in many places, particularly Democrats, and the increase of disinformation. And so there's a lot of efforts to figure out how to tackle that. But it's a game of whack-a-mole. So in many ways, I think that one of the best defenses is going to be to produce and disseminate accurate content rather than try to identify and debunk every piece of misinformation, because it also happens to be that the way we go about debunking misinformation actually helps it spread more and for people to believe it's true. So she's asking about churches and whether churches get involved. One interesting thing, particularly because in the African American community and the civil rights movement, churches played such a pivotal role. It's where people were able to come together, organize, heal. It's not the same in the Latino community. We are seeing, interestingly, they're still not the majority, but we are seeing more organizing through faith organizations, but more so on the conservative side. So there's a growing segment of the Latino evangelical community. And while it's not all uber conservative, we have some great allies that are very even-handed there. Definitely, those also are part of trying to increase the ranks of Latinos on the conservative side of the spectrum. And please don't get me wrong, I work for a nonpartisan organization. So I deeply believe that when we have candidates from both parties and both parties fighting for the support of voters, we all do better, right? If you follow the redistricting, you know that part of the intractability that we're seeing in Congress is part of having districts that are no longer competitive and where only the primaries are competitive, which really pushes people to distill the most extreme in their ranks. And then you end up with a bunch of kamikaze pilots in Congress and in other legislatures rather than people who are interested in what the job is, which is governing. Here.
Thank you. I don't have my teacher voice anymore. So I'm glad that the conversation's kind of filtered towards disinformation, because that is something, after having recently moved back to LA from Miami, I was very much aware of. Spanish radio Miami, until fairly recently, has not just been an outlet of disinformation, but in many cases flat out lies, either when it comes to domestic policy or sometimes foreign policy when it reaches out to especially the Caribbean. You mentioned getting out, instead of trying to debunk every bit of disinformation or these lies that get out in social media and in radio and YouTube, you name it. What are some specifics in terms of the general information we're trying to get out there to kind of make people realize that what sometimes we're seeing is not accurate? Because sometimes I think it's going to have to be more than simply, as you mentioned, within our own families or our own, social networks, where we see someone post something that's really not accurate in any way, shape, or form, and you have to kind of be the lead person to combat it and become the keyboard warrior. What is being done within organizations specifically like yours or the other type of organizing, agencies out there to combat this?
There are a number of organizations, not just in the Latino space, overall, that are really grappling with this issue. And somebody asked the means in that. One of the interesting things is that Cambridge Analytica, which obviously came to light as we were heading into the previous presidential election, they tested their model outside of the United States before, and during Brexit, before they brought it full on here. Cambridge Analytica may not be around anymore. Those folks and that work, it's like a Medusa, right? It's now extended in multiple places. And to be honest, organizations like mine and many others, we are all trying to learn as fast as we can how all this stuff works. And it is absolutely truth that algorithmic justice is the next civil rights fight, right? And we are seeing it go, how it's going into privacy, how it's going into employment, how it's going to control elections. It is interesting because most of us think about, if there's going to be election fraud, is because somebody's going to stop me from voting or somebody is going to intimidate me. And in some ways, the brilliant thing about the folks behind these schemes is that you don't need to commit fraud if you are controlling what voters think. They'll do it for you, right? And so it is a daunting task. You've seen, and they're not accountable enough. I mean, people who follow this know that even though Facebook was saying, oh, we just found out about this, they knew about it for like over a decade before that some of these things were happening. So there is a growing demand for accountability from the civil rights community about what these mega companies that are facilitating the spread of misinformation need to do. But we're playing catch up. Right. And I think that before we get to the point where we can get a handle of it, things are going to get uglier. And frankly, even if it's retail, I'm looking at my sister who's here too. My brother often plays that role with our WhatsApp threads. Like, hey, this is not true, right? Or like, you should double check it. we just need to do that for each other.
Hi.
Oh, here and then here.
Are we on?
Oh, it doesn't seem to be
Doesn't
on.
seem-
There you go.
Oh, okay. We're on now. Quick comment. My only prayer is that by discouraging people from voting, people will get so ticked off that they might actually go out and vote no matter what they do. And quick, narrow question. Being in Orange County, we have a lot of immigrants from both Asian, Vietnamese, and from Latino communities. And one of the questions my friends will often come up with, or comments you alluded to, is that I don't know enough.
Yes.
Deep inside their question is, I'm naturalized, but I'm not a real American. I don't know enough about all these issues so I'm not going to vote. And I would try and encourage them that if people know you're going to vote, then they'll pay attention to you. But I didn't know if Angelica and you had any ways you address that issue when you're going door to door with a group.
I'm going to let you answer that one while I get water.
That's exactly what we do, which is actually we focus on new citizen voters and also Latino voters, what we call infrequent voters. Many times they don't receive the information from the candidates on the issues because they're seen as like they're infrequent voters. We're going to spend our resources on these other folks. So it's a situation that continues, actually perpetuates the problem. So what we do is we actually first fundraise resources in order for us to create the education campaigns. And we call them various times, sometimes 5, 7 times, in order to remind them that there's an election. This time, we here in California, for those who live in California, we all received mail-in ballots. Basically, we would explain to them what the ballot was and this process, how they could actually do it. And then we were very specific about the date. This is election day, June 7th. And everybody needs that. So I just want to say the work we're doing for new citizen voters and for Latino voters is what we need to do for all voters.
For all voters.
Because we also saw the just very depressed turnout. And part of that has to be with the sense of not feeling confident with what you're selecting. I was telling a group of individuals, all of us who had a mail-in ballot all had to vote for judges, and I know that everybody was like, oh, okay, who do I vote for? So we just have to do more on the education and outreach, and that's what Shirla does with our citizen voters. And we are our folks are turning out in great percentages, hundreds of thousands of folks getting out to vote, and our hope is that increases. Okay.
We have time for one more question. Going to go here.
I just wasn't sure if you guys distinguish between misinformation and disinformation as you execute, because the disinformation is calculated to produce that, I'm frozen, I can't take action, and disinformation has traceable, identifiable patterns that can be taught. You can be taught, not on a case-by-case basis. This looks like disinformation.
Right.
Misinformation is a case-by-case basis. That's a lie, that's a lie, that's a lie. So in terms of your policies and actions, do you have strategies based on disinformation and misinformation?
So we are lucky that we have partners leading the charge on that are more in the digital space, and where it's certainly not the only space where these things are happening, but that is certainly the spaces where it's proliferating. So I am not the expert on this stuff. For us, I think the distinction is even more general, right? About intent, as opposed to, we all end up spreading information that may be incorrectly that we heard or whatever. I think that what we're seeing is a rise in the intensity of the one with deliberate intent to, from when you call voters and tell them Democrats vote on Wednesday and Republicans vote on Tuesday, right? That kind of stuff. Or other more nefarious things about, a number of things that they think are going to intimidate voters. And that's just talking in the voter space. So yes, I am not the expert on that, but thankfully there's a lot of folks that are putting their heads together to fight that. And also to look at the systems of how it's being spread to try to figure out how to also use those channels to provide accurate information. So I think that was the time we had for the last question. I did hear somebody say about, and I hear this all the time, right? We are so glad for young people, and young voters are going to save the day. And what I would say is, you don't get off that easy. Okay? No. We all are in it together. We cannot pass the buck on this one or any of the other ones ahead of us. So I am we've all been through this. Part of it is generational. Part of it is cohort driven. We all know that when we're younger, sometimes we break eggs and don't really watch if we're going to break our head. We sometimes get a little bit more concerned about both things. But we need all of us. The reality is that older Americans are super voters. That's even true among Latina women. Those older, 91% of them vote, right? So we need super voters in partnership with young and emerging voters. And we need to have all of us hold the people that claim to represent us accountable, and accountable also for safeguarding something that I'm still encouraged the majority of Americans believe, and that is that diversity is one of our country's greatest strengths. So with that, thank you so much for the opportunity and for everything you are doing in your fields and in your communities. Thank you.
So let's give her another round of applause. I really want to thank Clarissa for this incredible session that she's just had, sharing a glimpse into Latinx voting issues. I have a lot of hope for our country, for Latinos, and for immigrants because of leaders like Clarissa. Clarissa is an incredible leader, and her work inspires us and also gives us hope that things can be better. I also want to just thank all the alumni who shared their questions and those who are enjoying the live stream. Well, nothing could replace being together in person. The ability to host virtual events has allowed our community to come together and find new opportunities to be involved at Oxy. On behalf of the college, we hope that you will continue to participate in our virtual and in-person events, and that you stay connected and support the Oxy community in a variety of ways. So thank you again for joining us today, and I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the Alumni Reunion weekend. Be well and Io Triumphe. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Oh my gosh.